Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session. We'll be discussing the framework around plant genetic resources and how the governance of access to plant genetic resources are currently in the world, the state of affairs. Just a quick show of hands, who has heard of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture in the room? Okay, not a complete show of hands. And who has tried to access plant genetic resources that are within the scope of the international treaty? Okay, even less. Okay, so this is precisely what we're going to be talking about today. I am joined by a panel of speakers who will know a lot about the international treaty and the governance around access to plant genetic resources. Alwin Köpse is head of international affairs at the Federal Office for Agriculture in Switzerland, and he was the chair of the governing body of the international treaty in the recent negotiations in Lima last year. We also have with us David Bertioli. He is a professor at the University of Georgia on agricultural and environmental sciences. We have Soraya Bertioli. She is a senior research scientist at the University of Georgia. John Peter Schipper is CEO of Bejo Zaden. And Vania Azevedo, she's a director for the CGIAR Genebanks Accelerator. I think we can give them a warm welcome round of applause. So thank you for being with us. I would like to start with the international treaty and the current state of affairs. There were some negotiations recently in Lima that led to, I would say, no outcome. And when there is no outcome in international negotiations, usually people will talk about a failure of negotiations. But then also on a political level, when you would be looking at how a political discussion develops and then in the end there is an outcome, usually what people would say is, if everyone is equally unhappy with the political outcome, that's usually a great thing. And I'm just wondering, Alwin, as you were chairing these negotiations, do you feel that everyone is equally unhappy with this outcome? And therefore, do you think it is a good outcome?
Thank you very much. I mean, you noted there was one failure in the governing body of the treaty, but I will also say we had some successes. So there is, on the farmers' rights side of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, they adopted a strategy, a work program, so there's work to be done. In the area of conservation and sustainable use of these resources, also there we have a work package agreed. But I think where you refer to is the enhancement of the multilateral system. So the system, how you access these resources and how you share benefits. And indeed, the governing body wasn't able to agree on a new system. And most probably some people were happier than others, and so indeed the equity of unhappiness was probably not spared or shared among the participants. So it became quite early on in this week of negotiation clear that the parties were not able to agree on a package. The package included the SMTA revised, included a larger coverage of the multilateral system, and tried to address digital sequence information. So it's basically the question, how do we deal with new technologies where information is more important or can be more important than the material? And so we were not able to agree on a package. So what we did, we tried to unpack it. So say, let's try to agree on the revised SMTA now, talk about the coverage, come with an agreement in 2 years, and give space to actually think deep, what does new technology, what does artificial intelligence mean for plant breeding, and how can we capture that? This was charted out. The governing body didn't have enough time to actually go into all these details of that plan, but at least accepted to take it on board and take it out whenever the governing body feels the time is ripe to actually move forward.
But so we're trying to make improvements to a system that needs to give access in order to share benefits, in order to fund, for instance, the conservation of genetic resources, I mean, as one part. So for you, Vania, I mean, no outcome or no improvement of the system, does that make you unhappy at this point? Can you comment on this outcome?
Yeah, of course. Well, I cannot say that it makes me unhappy. If you see the numbers under the plant treaty, almost 90% of the germplasm shared, following the current SMTA, is shared by the CGIAR, Genebanks and breeding program. So the possibility of continuing with the plant treaty as it is, which we must acknowledge, it is a very sophisticated framework for policy and how we access and use germplasm for food and agriculture. The plant treaty itself is a major achievement, of course, with room to improve. That's why we have been discussing this. I feel like it could have been worse, because when we start talking about DSI, about tracing, tracking things, there were some ideas being discussed and proposed by some parties that could make it worse. So for us as Genebanks, as an international organization that has the mandate to host this germplasm in trust for the international community, it allows us to continue fulfilling our job, which is to make the germplasm available to users. It could be better. Of course it could be better. It's not cheap. We heard at the opening there is no free lunch, right? So it's not free to conserve germplasm. There is a huge cost. We can go deep there later on how much the CGIAR, for example, invests to assure that the more than 700,000 accessions that we preserve of more than 30 crops are freely available to users, irrespective of country, private sector, or farmers. So if we can improve how the treaty brings benefits and improve how we are able to preserve the best way possible, and at the same time know better what we have there, because nobody can use well what you don't know what is sitting there. So there is still a lot for us to do and improve together. So I'm not unhappy, but I would be happier if we could continue improving the framework of the plant treaty for sure.
I mean, I don't know, obviously, the dynamics. I don't follow the negotiations, but it seems that there is an attempt to improve a system. So the system is there. There is an attempt to improve it. On the other hand, there seems to be these kinds of packages that put many different issues together. And so in the end, the outcome is not there, but it could have been there maybe if only there was a part of those negotiations that were happening. You know, but at the moment you sort of link them to other things, it gets more complicated. John Peter, what is your assessment then? I mean, has this package approach allowed for a part of it, the access part, to not improve? And therefore, are you also then unhappy with the outcome?
If you ask me, am I happy or unhappy with the outcome, I'm unhappy with the outcome. And I think maybe good to explain, we are a vegetable breeding company, and for breeders it's extremely important that you have a wide genetic pool to be able to breed, well, new varieties. If you put the same ingredients in a pot and you stir it, and it's the same ingredients all the time, then nothing spectacular comes out. So if we really want to improve our varieties, it's important that you have access to genetic resources that are different than, let's say, the pool that we are breeding with. So biodiversity, access to genetic resources is important, and I think we all agree on that. I think that's not a debate. But by acknowledging it and putting systems into place, we only made it more difficult to access those genetic resources. And well, we are already now in a long process of let's say, discussion and trying to find a framework that makes it more easy to access genetic resources. And well, Lima was the first time that we were at the point that we might adopt it. And that failed, so that feels not good and makes me unhappy. Do I lose faith? No, I don't lose faith. I still think that we can make it happen one day.
Okay, so we're talking about potentially losing faith. No, you're not losing faith, but there is a question mark as to the future. And I have here a paper by David Bertioli and Soraya Bertioli. It's called The Tragedy of Biodiversity Governance and Principles for Reform. Okay? A paper you published, I believe, towards the end of last year, more or less at the time of the negotiations happening in Lima. What motivated you then to publish this paper, and what are you actually proposing here?
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today. Well, the paper is called Reviving Vavilov's Vision, so let me take you back to when I first came across Vavilov, which was, I was at university, and I found a very thick book published in 1926 by Russian geneticist Nikolai Vavilov. And he was one of the greatest geneticists and agricultural researchers of the 20th century. And the book was about his realization that crop plants didn't spontaneously appear, they weren't found in the wild. They were made by a process of cultivation and domestication of wild species. And that happened in certain centers around the world. And what he realized was that useful genetic variation was left behind during this process. And so you could actually improve crop species by carefully hybridizing them with wild species. And he proceeded to do this, and he proceeded to go on hundreds of collection trips around the world and make the greatest seed bank of his time, which was in St. Petersburg. So I remember being very inspired by this story. And I now race forward in time more than a decade later, and we were in Brazil. I'm English. I was in Brazil because we're married, Soraya's Brazilian. We're an academic couple, we work together. And we had decided to apply Vavilov's vision to peanut. And just to make it tangible, the sort of things that are possible, I'm going to race forward in time and draw attention to the image. This is the sort of thing that's possible. This is actually an image from last year in our fields in Georgia. The center two rows there, they're from the most popular cultivar of peanut in the United States. It's a great cultivar, but you can see that it's not doing well, and it's not doing well there because nematode worms have attacked its roots. Flanking it either side are peanuts that we produced. They have a little bit, they have actually a chromosome arm from a wild species called Arachistenospoma. And those peanuts at the side, they yield just as well as the one in the middle. And we've got a number of successes like that under our belt now. So this is what we were aiming for. Now, going back in time again to around 2000, we sort of were in a perfect situation. We were in, Soraya was in Embrapa, which is the public institute for agricultural research in Brazil. We had available to us the best seed bank of wild peanut species in the world, which had been made by a fantastic collector called José Valls, who had been collecting for decades beforehand. And the whole institute had a mission for improving agriculture. What we wanted to do was use Brazilian germplasm, Brazilian wild species, to improve a Brazilian crop in a Brazilian public institution. And when we started off, all of these things that I'm talking about were viewed very positively. Collection was viewed positively, hybridization was viewed positively. But what we saw was a change in culture that happened, a change that was initiated by the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Yeah, just follow up from what David said. We worked in Brazil, and that was my dream job. And we had everything, all the great ingredients to do just that. What happened, and we had collaborations. We had collaborations with international partners. We had funding from European Community, from Gates Foundation, and we were racing to get wild diversity, to improve the crop, to make it more resilient, to make it sustainable. And that was our vision. And around 2005, José Valls, the curator, he came to us in a bit of panic and said, we have to stop everything. We cannot collect anymore, you cannot send wild species abroad, you cannot send your hybrids, we have to stop everything. And of course it was a bit of panic, we were confused, and he himself he canceled his project with international funding, no collections, everything stalled. On our part, we didn't cancel our project, we carried on, but we weren't able to deliver a big part of what we were supposed to do. We made all these beautiful hybrids, but we weren't able to deliver them to our partners. So we were confused, we didn't know what to do. What happened, there was this change in culture, what was before we had freedom to operate. Then from freedom we had prohibition. Before, sharing seeds, collecting, sharing was seen with admiration. And now everything was seen with suspicion. And we were taken by fear. We were frightened of going to jail. We were frightened of getting a fine for not filling out the right form, or for not giving the right report, for not asking the right permission. The dark age descended upon us. It was like sadness. It was really, really sad. And we had to reinvent ourselves and to look and to see what are we going to do now. And we carried on the best we could over the years. Then we got very involved with the sequencing of the genome of peanut, the wild species and peanut. In 2013, David and I went for a sabbatical in the University of Georgia in the United States. And we couldn't believe how easy it was to work with the wild species of arachis that we were frightened of using in Brazil, we could use in the United States. Of course, the ones before the convention, not the ones afterwards. And the USDA has this amazing gene seed bank that we had access at our doorstep. We could do things like that. And our one-year appointment became a permanent position, and that's where we are now. So we are in the United States, but we come from very different backgrounds. We found that the private sector, the government, the industry, the university, we all talk together and we can all work together and we can make progress. So what we see is that we can transfer lines. We have this year, single-handedly, we transferred over 150 lines like that to Africa, to 5 countries in Africa with 8 different wild species that from Brazil we wouldn't have been able to do. We're fine. We reinvented ourselves. We are successful. We can do what we wanted to do. Not where we wanted to do, but we can do it nevertheless. And the species that is from there, that gave that resistance. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. So I want to show you the species that gave that resistance from this area, which was very rural. This is in Brazil. It's a place called Rondonópolis in the west of Brazil. That was the car that José Valls used for that collection. And that was in 1986. If you look at that lamppost behind the car, behind the truck, let's fast forward a few years. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? There. So that one accession is no longer, it doesn't exist anymore. Luckily, it was collected before the convention. It's multiplied in different seed banks around the world, because at that time when they collected, they divided, part stayed in their country of origin, part of the seeds would go to 2 or 3 different banks for development, for research, and for backup. So this accession is alive in the United States, in Argentina, in India, in many other countries. But how many hundreds of thousands of accessions are buried, are no longer available because of human agriculture, roads, houses, so they're no longer there. So this paradox of us being able to use Brazilian germplasm in the United States, seeing the frustration of our colleagues back in Brazil and in many other countries, this is not just with peanut, gave us, propelled us to say something about it and propose some suggestions, and David will tell you about it.
So, well, like Sarah says, we are actually being able to implement Vavilov's vision. But we had these frustrations. What happened was the convention came. It sort of had a knock-on effect of making hundreds of restrictive national laws, which created this environment where there's no longer collection and we're losing a lot of germplasm. To put in context about the treaty is actually a counterbalance to this. So we're really in favor of the treaty, and the treaty has been a partial movement in the right direction. The article, what we tried to do was make a rigorous analysis, we made a rigorous analysis, highlighting the human cost of all of this and the conservation cost. And we outlined in it 7 principles. I won't go through all of the 7 now, but they're philosophically based on observations of what happens when people follow these principles, good things happen. And I can summarize them. The test of the principles is, does the governance help conservation more than it helps destruction? Because if a biodiversity governance doesn't help conservation more than it helps destruction, then what's it doing? Does it help collaboration more than it hinders collaboration? Because if it doesn't, why is it an international treaty? And does it help access more than it hinders access? Because again, if it doesn't, what's it doing? And finally, is it judged on results or what people talk about? Because if it's not judged on results, it's not evidence-based.
So I understand that this is also a very personal thing. It really cuts across your personal story. And ultimately, you are advocating for a much more open access, and you see a value in having open access to genetic resources. On the other hand, international frameworks are based on sovereignty of the nations that are engaging in a treaty. And I think there is a very important point in relation to the treaty, is that ultimately we're talking about sovereign rights over genetic resources, which is very different to the kind of open access principles that you have just outlined. And so I'm just wondering, Alwin, when you hear these kinds of principles, and when you, I suppose, hear other principles in the negotiations where countries are fighting for the preservation of their sovereign rights over genetic resources, and let's also be clear, this is not based out of nothing. It's also based on very real biopiracy that has happened as well, that needs to be governed. So do you see these two forces as being ultimately impossible to reconcile?
No. So just a very short answer. I think important is what was said here already is agrobiodiversity, so the diversity of agriculture plants, their wild relatives, is very important to deliver what farmers need, which is seed that actually grow in a changing environment. We have climate change not only knocking at the door, but being present in the fields. And so we need to be able to adapt rapidly. And for that, we use, among others, this diversity. The second thing that is important is we are all interdependent. You know, crops, they traveled the world. They didn't stop. They were taking with them, they were adapted to local circumstances. So that is very important. I think that's kind of the two basic principles that make thinking about agrobiodiversity different from thinking about biodiversity at large. It's man-made, and we are interdependent, and it is of extreme value for the future food security. So I think in that sense, your principles are certainly very helpful to uncover that spirit and the story that goes with it. I think that's really important to have. But then on the other hand, the question about sovereignty and is such a regime possible, I would say yes, because in the exercise of their sovereign rights, countries agreed on a multilateral system for a limited number of plant genetic resources to actually facilitate the access, to make some rules clear, and to establish a benefit-sharing mechanism. So I believe what was possible 20-something years ago would be possible today as well, to actually include something related to wild crop relatives. But I think what is lacking is understanding of the importance, understanding of the urgency. So we do have a lack of political will to actually move forward on that path the treaty has taken. Now, the treaty isn't perfect, that's why we need to continue to work on that. But I think, that's not a contradiction. Open access, or we call it facilitated access, and sovereign rights of countries. They need to actually do something about this, because we don't only have public rights or common heritage on these materials, we also have private rights. And so we need to kind of put that all in a balance. So
But is this interdependence argument, does that resonate? Are you able to get that argument across? I imagine you're also discussing with representatives from different countries. Is that sufficiently convincing when they are trying to defend the principles of sovereign rights, and they also have an influence because they can choose to make certain plant genetic resources available or not? So it's not just the framework, it's also what you choose to make available.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the fact that we are coming together under a plant treaty and meeting and taking decisions together is because we are acknowledging the sovereignty of the countries to take decisions. But as Alwin already said, we are all interdependent. And I worked very closely with VAUS. I also worked for Embrapa for many years, so I feel their pain. And VAUS, every time he was going to talk with the Brazilian ministries to try to make the Brazilian law a little bit less restrictive, the first question he used to make is, what did you have for lunch today? And the Brazilian main dish is rice, beans, lettuce, tomatoes, potatoes, and none of those crops are originated there. So it doesn't mean that we don't need to acknowledge the sovereignty of the countries where the diversity occurs. That is there. The discussions are there, but we are interdependent. No country in the world depends on the crops that were originated only in their territory. And I don't think that the open access hurts the sovereignty, because again, when you agree in the plant treaty to expand the Annex 1, it doesn't mean that now I can go to any country and collect everything. The country still needs to put this material in a public collection, say what is available. We need to follow phytosanitary protocols. We need to sign an SMTA. And at the CGIAR, we have this policy for open access to data because we work with public goods. But we always say that open access doesn't mean access without responsibility. You are going to access the germplasm under the framework of the treaty, or you are going to access the data for use on a specific research. You still cannot patent the gene. You can still not patent the germplasm. You are assuming a responsibility. And we need to assure this exchange, because even with all the technology that we have, even with gene editing and artificial intelligence, to find the gene or the genes that will give a resistance to an emerging disease that you don't even know, you need to find that gene in the germplasm, and that's sitting in a gene bank, or that is in situ. Even if you can do gene editing later, you still need to study that diversity. So that is where we need to sit together more often maybe and agree that there is no policy framework that will make everybody 100% happy. But we need to find a way through that we can live with it, acknowledging that we are all interdependent, and that we need to find the best way to assure that as they showed these materials that no longer are in situ, how come all this framework, all these national policies are restricting the use and the way we are studying these materials, but they are not necessarily protecting the materials that are still there in situ and that are being lost. Biodiversity loss is a big reality. We have major gaps in gene banks still. We have done lots of studies with the crops that we preserve in the CGIAR gene banks. We know there is still a lot there in nature to find, and we can only do that together. And sovereignty is, well, it is the legal right of the country, the scientists that work for the government. We are talking about the private sector in the country. So we are all part of the same system. And I fear that we are moving towards some discussions that is leading us to things like us against them or them against us. But we are all interdependent for the food that we eat, for the knowledge that we generate, for the money that can help us generate the data, that can help us conserve these materials and assure that they are available for people. So open access doesn't hurt sovereignty, but we need to really join hands, the different sectors, and do at the expertise of each one what is needed for the entire pipeline to deliver what we need, which is food security at the end.
So you're trying to paint a picture where there's no them against us. On the other hand, there are those that provide access and those who use.
Yes.
And so if I turn back to John Peter, I mean, so we heard a very personal story from David and Soraya. I'm assuming that as a company, I mean, you will have a very similar experience, I suppose. I mean, access will have become more difficult. As a breeding company, you will try and access. Is benefit sharing a problem for you? And are sovereign rights and the complexity of access, to some extent because of the expression of sovereign rights over plant genetic resources, a problem and something that you see very difficult to overcome in the negotiations moving forward?
That's not one question, there are 10 questions in one.
Yeah. I trust you.
Oh my God. I do recognize the story. And to get access to genetic resources, it's more complex, but it depends a bit on the country where you are, etc. In Holland, we have a gene bank, and we can work together with the gene bank quite well. So that is a low hurdle, so to say. But in other places where you can't use the SMTA, you can't, well, it's not under the treaty, so the access is much more difficult. And then you have the bilateral system instead of a multilateral system. So that is difficult and restricting the access to genetic resources. One worry I have, bigger companies, because of the size and the number of specialists, etc., in the end they can manage, well, the access to genetic resources to a big extent. For smaller breeders, it's much more complex. And I think that is confirmed by the story you just told. So that's a worry, because there are many breeding companies. Many times we look at the big ones in the world, but there are thousands of breeding companies in the world. And also for the smaller ones, it's important to have access to genetic resources, and then we have to keep it simple. And the treaty makes it more simple. And that's why it's important that we have those agreements together and have, I tend to say, free access, but not for free. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the message that we are sending from the breeding industry. We are willing to contribute to the funds in the treaty, etc. That's not a problem. Mm-hmm. It's an input, like you have other inputs in your company, which you pay for. So that's not a problem.
So your problem is not on the benefit sharing. I would like to just push on one thing that Alwin mentioned, also to some extent Vania, on how breeding is developing. So the new techniques being employed. Alwin talked about the digital sequencing information. Do you think there is also a potential divide moving forwards on developments in breeding and techniques, technology, that in a way moves companies away from the need to access genetic resources? And will that be a problem, again, to rebuild trust into the mechanics of the treaty moving forward? Do you see a risk there?
You know, if we add new technical developments to the discussion, and there will be a new development next year again and next year again, so then we make it extremely complex. I like simple. Genetics is genetics, in whatever form. So you pay for the access, period. And that's the way I would approach it. Because, well, DSI was now one of the issues in the discussion, but, well, the next year it's a different thing. And I think when we keep it simple, it's genetics, and in whatever form, I think that's what you get access to. And over the years, we will do different things, new things with it.
You want to jump in there?
Yeah. Thank you. So we've told our personal story. What I want to emphasize is that this is not just our story. So there's a letter in Science called When the Cure Kills. It's signed by more than 170 scientists from 35 countries. And they are telling essentially the same story as we've told. How a culture of fear, a legal curtain between research and genetic resources. And one of the things that you've touched on is, well, sovereignty. How can we respect sovereignty? And I would say, well, clearly sovereignty is an issue. But if it was about sovereignty, why would these more than 170 scientists working within their countries, for their countries, be frightened? It's not about sovereignty. There's a culture change about fear. Scientists were turned into biopirates. So sovereignty is one layer of it, but it's a deeper change than that.
But maybe, Alwin, you can comment on the timing of the negotiations and what you see moving forward as a future framework. And I think especially in the context of development of technology and breeding, because obviously these two things are going to go hand in hand. Breeding is going to evolve, continue to evolve with technology, and this treaty will need to evolve taking that into account in one way or the other. So do you see a timing and a framework beyond which it might just become more and more irrelevant, dare I say?
I think what we need to do is understanding the underlying reasons why we didn't agree. It wasn't the first time, it was the second time we didn't agree. And I think that's going to be important, the trust issue. If you want to make a deal, you have to have a minimum of trust into your partner that you're actually not thrown over the table. That's one. Another one is actually understanding and be aware of the complexities these systems have. Already with material, it's quite complex, so we need to work on that. Then I think we negotiated 12 years, and we negotiated very much on a system that the most important or most innovative part was actually independent of whether you use the material or the information. There is a system in place under which you then pay benefits, share benefits. And that, I have to say, I don't really like the term benefit sharing. It's more kind of a reinvestment into conservation of PGR, into running this system that makes facilitated access possible. So I think we're going to hopefully take that part up again. Maybe a look at what was proposed in terms of way forward, which is a kind of an unpackaging, but keep the links still and try to understand those parts of the system. Really need to understand better, which is what kind of coverage the system has, so what PGRFA are actually in, which ones are out. DSI, do we need to do something, or is the subscription system, this club we wanted to actually establish, good enough for that? I think we haven't had a honest debate about this. So I think I see that there, but I would be cautious to rush into a new negotiation process. Really try to work through these issues. It will take a little bit of time. We have now 18 months, so to say, before the next governing body. Foster the understanding, build trust, and try to come forward with an approach that we actually can agree that's the right approach to be taken, and that's something where everybody's going to have to give something in. But so just don't expect to finalize something in November next year. I think we're going to have to re-establish a little bit of that trust that was lost on the way.
It sounds like the treaty can't really afford to have another round of negotiations that doesn't actually come to a form of a conclusion.
I wouldn't say it's not about the treaty, it's about providing a system that works. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, the treaty provides at this time the only system that works with the current system in place. But we are also where we need to improve that. Now, how we do that, I think that's at the core. It's conserving this diversity that is of extreme value in the long term, at least, and making it possible that actors like we have here at the podium or in the room actually can do their work. I think that's the aim.
Soraya, you wanted to jump in?
I did. The last place I wanted to be was in your shoes, because this is very hard to negotiate with people who come with the sovereignty in their minds, and they bring biodiversity as a bargaining chip. And they are there representing their countries, but I'm sure they don't represent the real interest of the countries. I've never been to a discussion like that, but if they knew what it takes to create prosperity, to create a cultivar, to create a product, the amount of investment and time, they wouldn't be thinking that everything they have is gold. Because if it was gold, pure gold, why aren't the biodiverse countries the richest in the world? Because we are an ecosystem. We need each other. We need industry. We need investment. We need technology. Just having the little weed, the little seed, means absolutely nothing. But bringing that as a bargaining chip, I think, is playing with fire, while everyone is going there thinking they have everything without giving in. We are losing biodiversity. We are playing with our environment. So I think I wouldn't like to be in your place, because I don't know how you can deal with everybody in the same room with their own interests. But sovereignty doesn't really make any sense in a place where everybody needs to eat. We need each other's germplasm. We need to exchange. We need theirs and they need ours. We need the industry. We need each other.
And in principle, an international multilateral system like the treaty is the best response to sovereignty, but it needs to work. Yes. And we're in a situation where the negotiations have not enabled to enhance the system, while in the meantime there is a need to conserve genetic resources. Let's not even talk about access, let's just talk about conservation, the basics. They need to actually be there somewhere. That costs money, requires a lot of investment, infrastructure, and a permanent system to keep these genetic resources in place. So I'd just like maybe a thought, an idea from each of you on how can we continue to conserve genetic resources given the current framework that we have. What is a kind of an immediate practical next step that you would like to see, for instance, Vania, to help you in your work of conservation? Give us an idea.
I need money. No. No, I think we can be much smarter than we have been in all these discussions, because after all, we all acknowledge, the industry, the governments, the scientists, everybody, that we need to preserve. We depend on the agrobiodiversity to continue evolving our agriculture, answering to the challenges that we have. So conservation is the major step one. It can be either through promoting better in situ and on-farm conservation that complements what Genebanks do, but we need to do it well, we need to fill the gaps, and we need to assure that whatever is being preserved is well preserved. It's very easy to say that I have a cold room full of seeds, but the seeds are at 20% viability, or I don't have enough seeds to make available to anybody. So what do I really have there? And unfortunately, that is the reality of most of the national gene banks, especially in developing countries. We have been trying to understand how are the materials sitting in gene banks available overall across the countries. I would guess that in national gene banks, average would be about 20 to 30%. Everything else is not viable or is not clean of diseases, or they don't know because they couldn't invest on it, or they don't have enough seeds to distribute. There is a lot of work to do. And I know that by experience, because I worked in the National Gene Bank. I was in charge of the Embrapa plant genetic resources for 8 years. And I know how difficult it is still for their gene banks to have seeds ready to be used. I moved to the CGIAR, I ran the ICRESAT Gene Bank, I ran the International Potato Center Gene Bank, and I know how costly it is. The investment that the CGIAR does, that the Crop Trust does to help us partially, it is costed. They came there and they estimated every single cost of everything that we have to do to assure that any time any accession is available to any user globally. And we have a responsibility because we host this in trust. The cost for maintaining about 740,000 accessions that the CGIAR preserves in its 11 gene banks is $26 million a year. And that is why we are able to answer to the requests. I would say that 95% of every request is immediately answered. But there is a cost. And currently, many of the countries represented here are the ones supporting us through the pooled funding of the CGIAR. CGIAR covers 20 million of these 26 million. And we are making all that available because these are public goods. But the cost is high. Crop Trust supports with a portion of this as well, and we are very thankful for this collaboration. And we were just talking about how we can fundraise better together. But there is more than that. Do you believe that we don't know most of what is really sitting there? It's impossible to take 700,000 accessions to the field and characterize for every single trait that might be of interest. We also, genotyping, sequencing. So I think what I would claim for is we need to find better mechanisms when we talk about benefit sharing. It's not just about depositing money in an account. It's about bringing money to the system to assure that these gene banks are well preserved, that the diversity is representative of what we need, that we are able to generate data together that is of interest of the industry, of the countries, of the national scientists. We need to reframe this thing of bringing money to the system to what do we need to do and how we are going to bring the money to do that together and benefit everybody at the end. So that is my claim at the road.
But a comment then from John Peter, because if this is not happening through access, so if we're not linking let's say the funding, okay, just to put it that way, if we're not linking the funding to access and benefit sharing, we're then talking about another funding model that is not linked to access, that is a more sort of, let's say, permanent support function that I'm assuming then the industry, I don't know which other player could have that role. Do you feel a pressure as an industry representative here to sort of deliver something or come up with something that is, as I understand it, then a bit outside of the treaty or in addition to the treaty? John Peter.
Well, when you look at the situation in Holland, I can say that we already support the gene bank to a big extent. Because a lot of the work that needs to be done in gene banks is done in kind by the seed companies in Holland for the gene bank. So basically that system we have in place. And it even goes further because the gene bank in Wageningen needs a new building and it's sponsored by the seed companies. So I think we do a lot, and with that we acknowledge the importance of the work of gene banks, etc. And building trust was mentioned. Sometimes we are a little bit in the situation, I don't know whether you say it this way in English, but in Dutch we say the chicken and the egg situation. Basically, companies tend to say, okay, we are willing to pay something, but what do we get back for it? And the other side says, okay, how much do you want to pay? Then we will tell you what you get. And we are stuck. And I think probably to gain some trust, to build trust, we might think of ways to form a coalition of the willing and say, okay, we start supporting Genebanks. And of course, we want to build trust in the end with the idea that the accessibility of the biodiversity is improving, getting more simple, etc., by the treaty. But I think there are different ways to think of this contribution by a coalition of the willing, because I think we have to move forward. And that's in the benefit of everyone.
I'd like maybe a quick reaction from Alwin, because we're talking about elements that could happen in parallel to the treaty, actually the actual function of the treaty. Do you see something that could help you build trust in the treaty if the industry and the Genebanks were to work better together in a certain way outside of the mechanisms of the treaty? Would that help you?
I think it would help. You have to. The system consists of, I would say, 3 pillars: the treaty, the crop trust, and the seed vault on Svalbard. And then we have many users. CG centers are users, private sectors users, other public research and breeders are users. And I think we have to take these 3 pillars. The treaty is directly treaty, the crop trust is half, it belongs to the funding strategy of the treaty, so the funding strategy of the treaty is already broader than only the benefit sharing fund. So I think we have the ingredients there, but we need to use them better to attract investment. Now, investment, what does this mean? It can be money, can be know-how, can be infrastructure. So we have to discuss about the mix. What do we need and who can bring what to the table? Unfortunately, countries, even Switzerland, we use, due to geopolitical circumstances, we use money differently now than we used to do. And so there is less money available for agriculture research, for sustainability in agriculture, all that. And so we have to think a little bit differently and think, I really think we have to think about what kind of mix do we need and who can bring what to the table, and leave that track of purely benefit sharing. It's a benefit I share, I do or I don't. No, we have to invest in a system that delivers.
Okay, Vania, very, very short, because I would like to get a couple of
very, very short. I didn't mean to propose that we should find something outside the treaty. Of course, that collaboration between industry, Genebanks is there, and it's very welcome. My intention was to say that we need to be smarter in the way that we frame how benefit sharing must be used and must come into the treaty, so we can preserve better and make the materials better accessible after all. So we can fill the gap and stop running after our tail. So I'm not proposing anything outside the treaty necessarily.
I might sometimes rephrase, and it's not always correct, so you do well to come back. Are there any sort of questions? I know we took a bit of time, but it's difficult to talk about these things in 20 minutes, you know what I mean? It's quite complex. Please, briefly introduce yourself. It'll work.
Thank you very much, all of you, particularly to you, Vania. You touched the key point, money. I need money too. My name is Santiago Moreno. I am responsible of the wild species crucifers germplasm in Madrid, the César Gómez Campo Bank. And we would like to help more to the breeding companies. Why? Giving them good passport data of a huge diversity of each species. And diversity for all the environments, having diversity of population. We don't have diversity of populations. We need to go back to the field to collect, but we need money. And my question is, who is going to put this money?
Yeah, we were touching upon this. I think there's also a comment here, just next to you. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Imran. I'm one of the Engine Youth Ambassadors. I'm also from Hyderabad, where ICRISAT is based, and I have a small seed bank of my own, hence the interest in this. There was mention that there's no policy that makes everyone happy, but I think farmers globally are unhappy because of this climate crisis that we are facing. While we are discussing a multilateral treaty on a very global level, there's an urgent need for products, for seeds, adaptation systems that farmers can take, where the seed sector can provide and academia and research can also fill in. So do you think this movement and this crisis can be used to bridge this gap of collaboration, building a network and ecosystem, and also maybe potentially inspire and invite a new generation of seed savers, breeders, industry professionals to continue the work, because this is not just about the next 10 years, but the next 100 years to keep agrobiodiversity really alive and really continue the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And there was another one just behind you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's me. Hi, hello. Jasmina Muminovic. I'm head of genetic resources with Bayer Crop Science and currently the chair of the Genetic Resources Coordination Group under the ISF. Thank you. Great conversation. I just wanted to highlight one important thing, which I don't think any one of you has mentioned. The treaty, well, actually, what has not succeeded, what we have not been successful with in Lima in the last year, is improve the system. But the system works, as Vania said, and it works as it is designed. So there is no expectation for certain type of use of the material under MLS. There is no obligation for the money to be shared with the system. There is a voluntary contribution expected. And you can also assume that many companies have been using the system but have not been voluntarily shared. There is no thing such as free lunch, but there is also no expectation that like, oh yeah, I should not pay, but I will. So that's also very human reaction, so it does not happen. However, there is obviously the need for money. There is a money need for gene bank preservations. There is money need for biodiversity conservation, not just agriculture, but global. And we see the pressure not just from the treaty, we the industry, but also from the CBD with the DSI, which of course was not the topic of the conversation today, but there is also an expectation for global biodiversity conservation to be also contributed to from companies in that regard. So I think, and I would like to hear your opinion, would maybe expanding the thinking to not just plant genetic resources, not just DSI, but what can companies, what can private sector do for biodiversity conservation, because it's our global commitment and global responsibility, joint of all of us, not just companies, not just countries, not just public research, but everybody, every one of us has that responsibility. So how do we connect that, let's say, global challenge with what we have on the table? Again, understanding we have failed to improve, but we did not kill the system. It's there, and we continue to use it, so it's available. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a challenging one for a short wrap-up, but we'll give it a try. So, on the funding, maybe just a quick reaction from you, Vania. Where can the funds come from?
Well, that's a very difficult question, especially when you talk about wild relatives. You will do the work following the national of the country where you want to collect. Usually the funds come from the country. And it is a very complex situation. In many cases, you need to have an approved project to collect wild relatives to get the permission, but to approve the project, you need to have the permission in advance. So we are always in a cycle, and it's very hard. And I must say that we have reduced significantly the collection of wild relatives, because most of the cases, they don't fall under the treaty, they fell under the CBD, and then there are lots of restrictions. So even doing it is difficult. Finding the funding is even more.
Maybe Alwin and David or Soraya on the climate crisis, will that push countries to find a solution on the treaty, just in order to make sure that breeding, amongst others, has access to traits that can help countries deal with the effects of climate change on agriculture?
Yeah, I think don't waste the good crisis. I think it is also an opportunity to actually understand the urgency and act upon. I'm convinced that when policymakers understand the urgency, they act. There's political will to act.
Okay. Maybe a quick reaction.
And I can see that we are in a room full of people who can help make a change, because money talks. We all need money. Industry has a little bit of money to spare, and if there is a push for putting all the crop species in the Annex 1, things will change quite rapidly. if there is a push for not including DSI in the treaty, we are not going to retrocess more than what we already done. If industry can have a push for changing the model system of financing, then we can start talking, we can start moving forward. So I think you in the room, you have a lot of power.
I will use those final words as the conclusion of this panel, because I think answering the third question more globally will be tricky, and I think that we had an exchange of a little over an hour, and it's hard to get both into the mechanics of the treaty and answer big questions on the conservation of genetic resources. I just hope that those who didn't raise their hand when they hadn't heard of the international treaty, now you have. Those who haven't yet tried to access plant genetic resources in the treaty, now you can try it. See if it's easy, see if it can be made easier, and I think you all have a responsibility to make it easier. Okay, so thank you for attending this session. Next up in this room is a fireside chat with Jeff Rowe, CEO of Syngenta. That will be at 4 p.m. for half an hour. Thank you so much for having been part of the conversation, and thanks to all the panelists. Thank you.